Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Loris Jarrett, Deputy Financial Secretary, Head of the Public Expenditure Division in the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service. I will be guiding you through the program's proceedings for this evening. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this public forum. This forum is being co-hosted by the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service and the World Bank. The forum will be examining the topic facing the fiscal risk of natural disasters, and this is with a view to raise public awareness of the nature of the fiscal risks associated with natural disasters and to outline some of the initiatives being pursued by the Government of Jamaica in planning for and managing these risks. At this time, I would like to acknowledge the presence of some of our distinguished guests. We have Dr. the Honorable Nigel Clark, Minister of Finance and the Public Service. The Honorable Shahini Robinson, Minister of Labor and Social Security, High Commissioners, Ambassadors, and other members of the Diplomatic Corps, Mr. Jorge Familiar, Regional Vice President of Latin America and the Caribbean for the World Bank, Ms. Tassin Syed, Country Director for Caribbean Countries, Latin America and the Caribbean, Ms. Galina Sotirova, Country Manager for Jamaica, World Bank, and also the moderator for the panel discussion, which will come up later on, Ambassador Douglas Saunders, Cabinet Secretary, Permanent Secretaries, members of staff of government departments and agencies, other representatives of multilateral, bilateral, and international institutions, Mr. Mark Golding, Member of Parliament and Opposition Spokesman on Finance and the Public Service, leaders of the private sector, members of the academic community, and members of the media. I welcome you all. We will begin this evening's proceedings with opening remarks by Ms. Tassin Syed, World Bank Country Director for the Caribbean, and she will introduce our main speakers for this evening. Our main speakers are Dr. the Honorable Nigel Clark, who will speak to the policies and initiatives being put in place by the Government of Jamaica in order to ensure that we can respond effectively to major disasters associated with the increased climate change vulnerability that we are seeing at this time. The other speaker will be Mr. Jorge Familiar, who will be discussing the challenges of building resilience and how the World Bank is supporting countries in this regard. Immediately following the presentations by Dr. Clark and Mr. Familiar, we will have a panel discussion which will be moderated by Ms. Sotirova, and she will also introduce the members of the panel. The panel discussion will be followed by a question and answer session in which members of the audience will have an opportunity to ask questions of the panelists. This session will be followed by the vote of thanks to be delivered by Mr. Trevor Anderson, as you can see on your program. I now invite you to welcome, or to help me to welcome, Ms. Tassin Syed, who will give us the opening remarks. Ms. Syed is a seasoned development professional with over 20 years of operational and leadership experience at the World Bank. She is currently the Country Director for Caribbean Countries in the World Bank And prior to this, she served in managerial positions in Europe, Central and Southern Asia. She holds a master's degree in law and diplomacy. Ladies and gentlemen, please, Ms. Said. I just want to say that she will then introduce the speakers on conclusion of her opening remarks.
Thank you, Ms. Jarrett, for the welcome. And I apologize to have come to the stage sooner. You had not quite completed. I wasn't expecting that I would be introduced as well with my CV. Thank you very much for that. All protocols observed, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it's a personal pleasure and delight to be back in Jamaica this evening to be part of this extremely important discussion that will happen this evening. Let me first begin by saying that 2018 is actually a very special year for us at the World Bank Group because we are marking 55 years of our development partnership with Jamaica. Hence, it's an occasion to celebrate the results the country has accomplished and also for us to, in a very humble way, celebrate our small contribution to those results. Since the inception of our partnership in Jamaica, the World Bank Group has together provided financing close to $3 billion for operations, about 150 operations or so. And these span across the entire spectrum of infrastructure development, macroeconomic support, and most important, human development support for health, education, and social protection. I'm here for a few minutes only, and I wanted to touch upon why today's forum and this event that is actually the brainchild of the finance minister, and we are very grateful for you to have suggested that and to have asked our vice president to come in for this, comes at a very relevant and timely moment for a few important reasons. Firstly, let me say that what happens in Jamaica doesn't stay in Jamaica. And the reason it doesn't stay in Jamaica is because Jamaica sets the example and the tone for the rest of the Caribbean nations. And hence, it's extremely important to share the lessons of what Jamaica has accomplished. And the first point really is that the excellent example that this country has demonstrated through, and I think this was mentioned earlier this afternoon when we had a meeting with the president by the finance minister, that the bipartisan political support for macroeconomic reforms across two administrations. And I heard that myself last year when I visited and met across the political spectrum, the leadership. You have actually succeeded in, through prudent fiscal management, to reverse decades-long trend of very high debt, and we know that the numbers, my vice president will also mention that in his presentation, from 150% down to 100% in less than 5 years as we stand here today. And that's a very important number. It's still huge, but the progress is fantastic. We also see that your reserves coverage is rising. The Prime Minister has tweeted about it also recently. And it's a clear testament to the resolve of not just the government of the day, but also of your stakeholders across the country, and including the private sector, to align themselves to the reforms you are embarked on. The second reason why this forum is very timely is that it comes really very close at the heels of, which many of you might be familiar with, the recently released report by the United Nations of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which reports on the impacts of global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. This report actually was really, took quite a bit of center stage at the recently concluded World Bank IMF annual meetings in Bali. And here, the key messages from the report, and one that hits very close to the Caribbean states, and especially Jamaica, is that we are already witnessing the consequences of a 1 degree Celsius increase of global warming. Last year's almost twin hurricanes in September were a testament to that. The Category 5 hurricanes. This year, there have been a spate of high flooding in several states in the island states in the region. But the good news is that nations across the Caribbean and also under the leadership of Jamaica are particularly ahead of the curve in wanting to, committed to, and developing actions that are critical for the sustainability of small islands. I do want to mention two more points in relation to Jamaica specifically, that Jamaica has been for several years a front runner among island states in developing resilience against natural disaster. Of course, the glass can never be full, but it is moving towards, at least we see it as a definitely half full glass, and we are proud to be partnering with the efforts of the country in this area. The key part of resilience is physical resilience, and you're starting already with the newly established building codes and regulations. And the reason I mention this is because this physical resilience is significant as these are important steps towards, first, reducing physical vulnerability, second, expanding insurance for homeowners, and thirdly, reducing fiscal costs over time by reducing losses for reconstruction. Also, several efforts are being made for adaptation. That includes ecosystems and coastal resilience and protecting infrastructure against coastal erosion and flooding. So while these are really highly encouraging developments, and I did want to, in the opening remarks, note these developments because it's extremely important that at such events where we are discussing disasters and natural disasters, that we begin with a sort of a feel of encouragement where things are moving forward. So that's why I wanted to acknowledge all the good work that's been done so far. But this is a progress that can be threatened in just one major adverse event. And that's the reason we are sitting here today. A recently published joint Ministry of Finance and World Bank report highlighted that Jamaica also needs to work towards reducing the fiscal risks associated with natural disasters. And you're going to hear about this today in much more depth by our key speakers and also during the panel discussions. I do want to, before closing, mention that we are extremely grateful as the World Bank Group for the partnership that we receive globally and also in the Caribbean with our development partners ranging from the EU, the UK, Canada, Japan, and all other partners with whom we collaborate, including multilaterals such as the IDB. And in this connection, there will be also an important event in Washington, DC, jointly coordinated by IMF, World Bank, and the IDB on building resilience against disasters. You will be hearing a lot more on a 360-degree approach to disaster management and enhancing resilience that we are now looking at, encompassing not just infrastructure, but fiscal, financial, environmental, and human capital, human development resilience. At this time, I would like to introduce our two key speakers. Let me begin by first introducing, and I think you, sir, need no introduction in this forum, but I would still do that. The Right Honorable Nigel Clarke, Minister of Finance and the Public Service, who assumed office as Minister of Finance in March 2018, following his successful election to the Assembly, to the Parliament in the last elections. Previously, we have been engaging very deeply with you as advisor to the Prime Minister and also as Ambassador Plenipotentiary for Economic Affairs and Vice Chairman of the Economic Growth Council, established by the government. Dr. Clarke has held several important roles in the public and private sector, and that is really the key strength that he brings is his exposure and experience in the private sector as chairman of various bodies and authorities. He's a graduate of the University of the West Indies and a Rhodes Scholar, and we discovered recently that you are an expert mathematician. You're DPhil in numerical analysis from the University of Oxford. This was a recent discovery, so I thought I must mention that, for me at least. Second, let me introduce Mr. Jorge Familiar, who has been actually the regional vice president, the first regional vice president in 30 years from Latin America region to head the Latin American Caribbean program in the World Bank. At the risk of being admonished after this event by my boss, I will say that he wants to be introduced now as the Vice President of the Caribbean and Latin America region. Mr. Familiar leads the relationship with the highest level of government and across our stakeholders and our program, the financial program and advisory engagement of over $30 billion in around 33 countries of the region, of which a very large number are from the Caribbean countries, of course. Since 2010, this is his second vice presidential appointment at the World Bank. He was vice president and corporate secretary of the World Bank Group from 2010 till 2014, where the key role that Mr. Familiar played was facilitating dialogue and promoting cooperation between the board and the management of the World Bank. So there can be no better person to coordinate the engagement for Jamaica between the various stakeholders on the objectives that the country wants to move towards. Let me close by saying that Mr. Jorge Familiar has been personally championing the agenda of resilience in the Caribbean region for several years, and more so after the last year's twin, what I call the twin Category 5 hurricanes, and on especially looking at developing innovative financing solutions. So warm welcome to everyone. I know you welcomed everyone, but let me, on behalf of the World Bank, especially say that we are humbled and honored to be invited to join this event with you and to be present here. Thank you very much.